Welcome to a new week of Daily Devotions. I'm Stuart Holman and this is the Growing Disciples program. This week we're continuing in our series on the book of Genesis. And you might remember that over the last couple of weeks we've looked at the prologue, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which set the stage for the action. They've given us a worldview, a context for understanding everything that is now about to happen. Of course, the main actor, the key figure, not only in the prologue but actually throughout, is God himself. He is the one unchallenged over all creation. He is supreme. Well, at least until Adam and Eve choose to disbelieve God and choose evil instead, represented by the snake. Humanity's embrace of evil resulted in a curse. God's vice-regents now have a predisposition to sin and have been consigned to death. The only hope offered, embedded within the curse, was that one of Eve's offspring would crush the head of the serpent, that is, ultimately defeat all evil on behalf of humanity. Big problem, however, is as we've watched the rest of the prologue, Genesis 4 through 11, as we watch that unfold, the problem is that humanity is a very unpromising lot indeed. How is it that God will fulfill his promise of reversing the curse? Who will be the serpent crusher? Well, as we now turn to Genesis 12 through 50, we're going to start to see kind of an answer to that question, even if it's not entirely clear yet, nor is it fully realized. At the beginning of chapter 12, we're introduced to Abram, or Abraham as he will become known. And God addresses Abram and he says to him, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." There's a lot going on here, but notice there are three key categories of blessing. There is land, there is nationhood, and there is blessing. And the promise that through Abram's people, all peoples on earth will be blessed. The serpent crusher now has a family lineage. We know from where he's going to come. And this commitment by God sets up the narrative for now, not only for the rest of the book of Genesis, but actually for the rest of the Bible, the rest of time, and even beyond it. Those three categories form the tracks on which it's all going to run. There is land, that is place, God's place. Secondly, there is nation, that is a people, God's people. And thirdly, there is blessing, that is relationship, a relationship with God. And so Genesis chapters 12 through 24 tell the story of Abram's response to God's promises, repeated, sealed with a covenant and explored. Through the epic narrative, we notice that Abraham takes time to grow into the man of faith that God is calling him to be. There are missteps, there are failings, some good intentions, and there is ultimately a commitment, an emerging commitment to live as God's man, as God's nation in the place God has promised. And through the narrative, we encounter multiple threats to the fulfillment of God's promise. How can it happen when Abraham has no children, when his wife is threatened, when age comes creeping up? Let's now just take a few moments to dive into one of those threats, just one of them, the one which demonstrates most clearly Abraham's growing maturity as a man of faith, believing these promises of God. I'm referring to the time Abraham was asked to sacrifice his promised son, Isaac. We're in Genesis chapter 22. And the way into this strange account of God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and then waiting until the very last moment on top of the mountain before providing a way out, it's to notice what the narrator says is going on at the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 22, the Holy Spirit-inspired narrator makes two key interpretive statements. First in verse 1, and then immediately after the climax of the action in verse 14. Verse 1, the account begins, sometime later God tested Abraham, and then the story launches with God speaking to Abraham. To get the meaning of this story, we need to understand what it is for God to test Abraham. We usually think of a test as an exam with a result. It's either a pass or it's a fail. In this sense, we wonder if Abraham is going to be good enough, devout enough to sacrifice Isaac and so to become acceptable to God. But this verb to test doesn't always mean a pass or a fail examination. In Hebrew, it also means to prove or to refine, to demonstrate. So in this sense, when gold is proven, it's heated up in a crucible so that the dross is removed and its purity is verified and demonstrated. Testing, in this sense, is an experience that proves and demonstrates something. What is already true is revealed and made clear to those looking on. And so what is it that's demonstrated by this strange story? Well, the narrator helps us again at the end of the account, verses 13 and 14. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So when the climactic action is all done, the whole situation is resolved, Isaac is not killed, and we're told that Abraham calls the place, the Lord will provide. Whatever it was that was being demonstrated, proven and tested in verse 1 is now made clear through the naming of the place. It turns out this passage in Genesis 22 is not about the sacrifice that we must provide for God. Instead, we are to know that God provides the sacrifice for us. That's the punchline. That's what Abraham demonstrated, and the narrator wants to ensure that we as the readers understand. The God of the Bible never asks for sacrifice, particularly sacrifice of children, to buy his blessing. Instead, Abraham trusts that God will be true to his promise to bless the world through his son Isaac, and through him, the one to come who will crush the serpent's head. Kind of love Abraham's reply to Isaac when, perhaps a little nervously, he asks his father, where's the animal for the sacrifice? Verse 8, Abraham says, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. With Christian hindsight, we see that God is the only one who sacrifices his son to bring about salvation. It is God's son alone who dies willingly to bring us back to God. Only that singular event at the centre of human history, the cross of Christ, warrants such an extreme prophetic foretelling as this event with Abraham and Isaac. Indeed, Mount Moriah, where Genesis chapter 22 is set, many years later becomes Jerusalem, the place where God's Son will be provided as the lamb of sacrifice for the sins of the world. This prophetic pre-enactment takes place on the same spot. So as you reflect back on Abraham, and perhaps you're familiar enough with the whole Abraham narrative from Genesis 12 through 24, the thing that strikes me is that Abraham's life of faith takes place in a fairly ordinary world. This sacrifice event in Genesis 22 seems to be the exception that proves the rule. Everything else, even the conflicts with surrounding peoples and kings, the moving around from place to place, the business of farming and trading, it's all pretty normal stuff. This is the context where we are to live for God. We make faith-based choices when it comes to children, to families, and where we're going to live. Our readiness to exercise our faith will determine our level of integrity, whether in business or in dealing with neighbours or pharaohs and kings. We will tell the truth, the whole truth, even when we think it might be to our detriment. We choose to live according to God's promises even when things don't make sense. And yet, we have God's promises set clearly before us in His Word. We act on the presumption that God will do what He said He will do, knowing that He is able and that He is fully trustworthy. That's how we grow as disciples of Jesus. So, what might we take away then from this very brief survey of Abraham's walk with God? How might Abraham's faith stir ours today? By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore.